Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We have a very special discussion. As you know, we have a um, unique situation that has transpired with the federal government, and especially with President Biden in this past week, which is basically allowing for pardons regarding cannabis. But most importantly, he started a discussion regarding rescheduling. And in the past, rescheduling has involved many different things. I would like to welcome Debbie Moran, George Armstrong, Tony Landry, Michael Crowitz, Wade Laughter, Mary Lynn Mathry, and Al Byrne for tonight's discussion. I am ATN Fontan, and I will be your moderator this evening. I am going to start tonight with a very interesting page, which is usually one that we avoid, I was always taught to avoid, which was the DEA. And so we're actually going to go directly to the DEA's website, and we're going to start there tonight on drug schedules and drug substances. And certain chemicals used to make drugs are classified into 5 distinct categories or schedules, depending upon the drug's acceptable medical use and the drug's abuse or dependency potential. The abuse rate is a determinant factor in the scheduling of the drug. For example, Schedule 1 drugs have a high potential for abuse and potential to create severe psychological and or physiological dependence or physical dependence, pardon me. As the drug schedule changes, schedules 2, 3, etc., so does the abuse potential. Schedule 5 drugs represent the least potential for abuse. A listing of drugs and their controlled substances are located at the Controlled Substances Act scheduling or the CSS scheduling in alphabetical order. So, as we go down here, we see the schedules. And of course, we start off with Schedule 1. Scheduled drugs, Schedule 1 drugs, substances, or chemicals are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Some examples of Schedule 1 drugs are heroin, lysergic, LSD, marijuana, and peyote, etc., ecstasy. Schedule 2 drug substances or chemicals are defined as drugs with a high potential for abuse, with use potentially leading to severe psychological or physical dependence. These drugs are also considered dangerous. Some examples of Schedule 2 drugs are a combination of products with less than 15 milligrams of hydrocodone per dosage, i.e., Vicodin, cocaine, methamphetamines, methadone, Dilaudid, Demerol, Oxycontin, fentanyl, Dexedrine, Adderall, and Ritalin are all Schedule 2 drugs. Schedule 3 drugs are substances or chemicals are defined as drugs with moderate to low potential for physical or psychological dependence. Schedule 3 drugs abuse potential is less than Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs, but more than Schedule 4. Some examples of Schedule 3 drugs are products containing less than 90 milligrams of codeine per dosage um, unit, ketamine, anabolic steroids, and testosterone. Schedule 4 drugs, substances, or chemicals are defined as drugs with low potential for abuse and low risk of dependence. Some examples of Schedule 4 drugs are Xanax, Soma, Darvon, Darvocet, Valium, Ativan, Talwin, Ambien, Tramadol. Schedule 5 drugs, substances or chemicals, are defined as drugs with lower potential for abuse than Schedule 4 and considered of preparations containing limited quantities of certain narcotics. Schedule 5 drugs are generally used for antidiarrheal, antitussive, and analgesic purposes. Some examples of Schedule 4 drugs are across preparations with less than 200 milligrams of codeine or per 100 milliliters Robitussin AC, Lomatol, Modafen, Lyrica, and Parapepticolin, something like that along those lines. Okay, so that is there directly from the schedule from the DEA's own website. So, why does it matter? What does it matter to us? And so, we do have a guest tonight at the welcome of our good friend Michael Crowitz, Stubby Moran, and she is an expert on this. She is a former commissioner as well as worked in the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission from 2013 through 2016. While serving on the commission, she was also a member of the Executive Committee, Policy and Research Subcommittee, and was chair of the Education Subcommittee. She was responsible for developing educational programs for doctors and patients, and was also an integral part of creating the current regulations. Before the commission, she was a president and founder of Moran Consulting Incorporated. There, she advised both brand and generic drug makers on the FDA approval process. Ms. Moran was a senior director of regulatory affairs at Alpharma, a generic drug manufacturer, where she directed the submission activities for new and abbreviated new drug applications to the FDA. She has spent over 30 years in the U.S. pharmacological industry. Ms. Moran received her Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Iowa State University. So this is why we have called on her. And our first question will be to her. And what are the basic things to know about the 5 schedules? And why does the cannabis industry and movement hate and fear Schedule 2 so much? Thank you for joining
Well,
us.
thank you, Edian, and everybody for letting me join your group tonight. I was really looking forward to this. I can't think of a better way to spend a Friday night. Anyway, so you went through the 5 schedules based on, the DEA definitions. Behind that, though, are other requirements and restrictions, and they are imposed both at the federal level through the DEA process, or the FDA process, but also at the state levels through state boards of pharmacy. So when you're talking about a Schedule 2, you are talking about some of the most restrictive manufacturing controls. So in other words, and this isn't just security about, the vault or the secure area where you keep the active pharmaceutical ingredients that might go into the drug product. It's all the stages of the drug product manufacturing. And so this imposes quite a burden on a manufacturer to maintain these levels of security and oversight during the manufacturing process. There's also quotas that have to be met, just like with Schedule 1. So basically, all of the manufacturing requirements in Schedule 1 are in Schedule 2. The only difference is that FDA are allowed to approve these drugs because, as you read in the definitions, they have medical value. And so when you're looking at the state level, for example, a Schedule 2 drug a prescription can only be written for a 30-day quantity. So if you look at some of the states that have, medical cannabis rules, Maryland, and that's the one I know best, one of the reasons that we restricted to a 30-day supply was we were trying to mimic some of the state level Schedule 2 requirements as far as dispensing and prescribing. In Schedules 3 through 5, you can, and the other thing with Schedule 2, there's no refills. So in other words, if you have need for drug beyond 30 days, you have to get a new original prescription. And it's just, it's a hassle to the patient, and it can be an inconvenience. Schedules 3 through 5 are eligible for refills. The amount of refills vary depending on whether it's 3, which I think is limited to 5 refills in 6 months, down to 5 where it's unlimited if you so need it. There's also labeling requirements for all these schedules, and inventory records, especially for Schedule 2, are very, very strict. The one thing that I find interesting is if you think about, and this is a little digression, but if you think about the opiate crisis over the last 2 decades, more or less, the DEA plays a large role in responsibility for how this got out of control. Because while the drug companies have reporting requirements and quotas that they have to report to DEA, especially with Schedule 2s, the DEA also has a requirement to control and watch distribution. which clearly didn't happen when you see, little tiny cities in West Virginia that are receiving millions and millions of Oxycontin that, couldn't even begin to, match the need in a little city, a little town like that. So there's a role that the DA plays in this when they're doing their job, as well as the manufacturing companies. So why do we not like Schedule 2 for cannabis? First of all, I do not believe it fits into any of the category, or any of the characteristics of the current Schedule 2 drugs. Codeine, for example, codeine in its iterations, different salt, different, and in combination with other active ingredients, is in 4 out of the 5 schedules. So one would say, well, this is the same molecule. But if you look at the some of the criteria for scheduling, codeine straight in its certain salt form is in Schedule 2, but codeine mixed with other cough suppressants or cough expectorants, whatever, has a very, very low potential abuse. So it's also in Schedule 5. It also depends on the concentration. So if we go back to cannabis, I believe the 2 FDA-approved drugs that contain Marinol and Dronabinol are, Marinol is in Schedule 3, and I believe there's another one that's actually in Schedule 2. So FDA is going to look at those as benchmarks. So if we say the FDA is going to be in charge of this universe, if we have a national law, they're going to look at their history, they're going to look at their precedent, and they're very likely going to say, well, we've already done this, based on the human abuse potential studies, which will have to be performed. They will then make a determination of the human abuse potential and then recommend to DEA 2 or 3. So you can imagine a high concentration of a tetrahydrocannabinol product. We have in Maryland 100 milligram THC capsules, not to my pleasure, but does that have a high abuse for potential? One would argue yes. Would that necessarily belong in a Schedule 2? Is it the equivalent of an 80 milligram Oxycontin? Those are kind of rhetorical questions, but I'm trying to say this is the FDA, that the mindset the FDA is going to have if they're in control of this, and that's how their thinking is going to proceed.
Now, do you think it's going to land into the FDA's hands? Previously, of course, it's been in the DEA's hands. And we saw very interestingly that the president, of course, spoke directing the USAG and the HHS now, which is a kind of a shifting in the decision making which had been in the past. So could you possibly speak toward that as well, Debbie?
Sure. So just fundamentally, anything that is going to be labeled as a drug or a dietary supplement or a food additive or anything nutritional is going to be within the authority of the FDA. So if you want to have a drug, you're going to have to make claims. You're going to have to substantiate those claims with clinical trials. There is no way around that. If you want to be an over-the-counter drug, for example, there's 3 pathways. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Just a second. Michael Krause and I had talked about, the OTC process. That still goes through the FDA, whether it is a RX to OTC switch, or it's an original, I want this to be an over-the-counter drug, I'm going to follow the FDA rules to get approval for an over-the-counter drug, or it's something that is just naturally considered so safe, like a laxative or an antacid, that there's monographs for those that are established. And you follow those monographs, you self-affirm, you can get a product onto the market. But it still involves the FDA. So all of this involves the FDA.
And it's very interesting because there was a monograph just recently on cannabis that was submitted just a few
Yes,
weeks ago. So
it's open for comment until the end of December.
correct. So that is something that is happening in present day, in current time. So that is something that people can respond to. Thank you very much, Debbie, for those
You're welcome.
very concise explanations. because it's a very confusing issue domestically, and then when, of course, we start talking about internationally, the numbers shift and it becomes a little more crazy. But we're not going to go there today. So I'm going to start and pose a question to our V.A.C. group, because this is kind of going to be a discussion that we're going to have. We just spent a month ago today, we were in Capitol Hill having our first of 26 meetings on Capitol Hill with members of the Armed Services and the Veterans Armed Services Committees. So mostly Republicans, because we were tasked by the National Cannabis Industries Association to reach out to those that were a tad unreachable, to those that were regularly part of the discussion. So we took that with a gusto, and it was a very interesting series of meetings. But regardless, we have to now, decide for ourselves and as a group, where do we stand, and what schedule are we interested in, and what schedule do you think cannabis should fall into? And I'm going to start off with Michael Krowitz, because he is one of our most experienced members, who's been working on this at the UN level as well as at the national level for decades. So I'm going to start off with Michael Krowitz.
Thanks, ATN. This conversation is sort of multifaceted. It's got simple conversations, but then it's got embedded in it very complicated conversations. But on its face, just on its face, there's a conversation that I found absolutely fascinating. Carl Olson, who we had on our roundtable just a couple of weeks ago, he actually, we didn't even talk about this, all the stuff we talked about. He's a very interesting person, but he actually got into a great conversation with the FDA, and he was asking a very pointed question about Marinol. And he was basically poking at what they call the delivery device, which in the case of Marinol, which if you don't know, Marinol is THC, essentially. It's just a pharmaceutically derived, pure synthetic, or even plant-based, if it's not produced inside the United States. I can explain that later. Pill that's suspended in a sesame seed oil capsule. And it's this sesame seed oil capsule that makes it rather special. And he was sort of poking at that, trying to figure out, what exactly makes it the drug that it was. And it was Schedule 2, which is interesting. And interesting is that at the time, it was in the 1980s, the federal government had taken its research on cannabis, handed it over to industry and said, here, make a pill and make it so it doesn't get people high. And what they came up with was the thing that gets you most high with no restraints. Something that actually many patients complain that it gets them too high because it's just THC. It has none of the buffers, as you would call it, of maybe CBD or any other materials in the plant that might actually tone down the pure THC effect. So it is just straight THC, and it came out Schedule 2, which made sense. If you're going to take something that was Schedule 1, make it into a pill, put it on the market, they made it Schedule 2. And I think that's where their guidance came from, as far as what schedule should cannabis be in, 1 or 2. You're talking about from the 1980s and 90s. I don't know of any new guidance that the DEA or FDA has come out with on that regard. What happened later was even more interesting, because as this little tiny drug company is selling this drug, they're making a lot of money and a lot of people are taking it, and nothing happened. There was no downside at all. I mean, other than it was super expensive. They went back to the FDA and they said, look at this. There's really very low abuse potential. It really doesn't make sense for us to have to deal with Schedule 2. And they said, you're right, we agree. We'll make it Schedule 3. And at that time, and I believe since, it's the only drug ever down-scheduled from Schedule 2 to Schedule 3 in the entire history of the Controlled Substances Act. But here we are with essentially the quote active ingredient in cannabis in Schedule 3 and the plant material still in Schedule 1. And Carl went to the FDA and went back and forth about 10 different letters before they finally broke down, and they said it to him straightforwardly. Drugs are scheduled aligned with their active ingredient. Whatever schedule the active ingredient is, that's where the plant material belongs. The plant material does not belong in a more restrictive schedule than its active ingredient. There you had it, black and white, right from the FDA. This isn't like a regulation or anything, but as far as I can tell, it's an overarching part of their way of doing business. It's part of their They're a fundamental understanding of how things work. So there you have it. Ever since the 90s, cannabis has been inappropriately scheduled in Schedule 1, belonging at least in Schedule 3 to be in parity with its active ingredient. So that's the most simple, believe it or not, the most simple string that you could pull on this conversation.
All right, Council Member Laughter.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to your question, Jen, and I wanted to thank Debbie for dropping in. That was a fascinating download. I personally, and I don't know how well it would work, would love to see cannabis descheduled. I think to a point that we've discussed before, it's a plant. It's not a drug. You can make drugs from it, but cannabis itself is a plant. And we'll go off into other tangents later in this conversation, I'm sure. But one of the things that just occurred to me is that Papaver somniferum is the Latin botanical name of the opium poppy. You can grow opium poppies in your yard, and nobody's going to come and arrest you unless you score the pods and start trying to make opium. And if you do that on acres and acres and acres scale, you can make heroin, which is Schedule 1. But I don't think cannabis and heroin, cannabis and opium poppy have very different effects in the human body. And I really think that I personally, again, I'm a big fan of the plant. I really don't think it belongs on a schedule at all. I do think it deserves, the consumers deserve protections for health and safety as far as contaminants and accurate dosing information, but it's really not a medicine. It doesn't lend itself to being one. And I'll stop there. I'm sure this is going to be fun.
Oh, I think it is, because I even raised my hand to respond. And I'm going to respond here first as a dispensary owner. My dispensary turns 23 years old this month. So I have the oldest operating medical cannabis dispensary in the United States. I have been operating for the past 4 years as a recreational. So I would state that cannabis, from my experience as a retailer for 2 decades, is that if it has to be scheduled, it's already a Schedule 5. It's already over the counter. We have seen decades of efficacious safety. I was a proponent. Was a pioneer in testing back in the aughts to bring testing to California, and made it in my city of Berkeley, and then it became mandatory in the state. So I agree completely, Wade, with as long as the protection of the consumer is held to a high regard, which many people have and I have fostered for decades. So I have seen Schedule 1, and we already existed and created what we exist under Schedule 1 as it is. So in my opinion, Schedule 2 is a no-go, so is Schedule 3. And Schedule 4, just based off my experience, as well as not only having that, but having consumer protections such as counterindication forms. So if anybody had, we inadvertently in Berkeley had a city councilman's wife eat too much of an edible and went to the hospital, and then came to us and said, hey, I had a contraindication with a particular medication. So we had a contraindication form, which we had them fill out so that we could get a better understanding, because we have no guidance from an FDA, etc. So these are guidance that we have put the bumpers on the industry ourselves, and other states as well as agencies have followed suit. But I can't say that everybody has followed the same ethical road that necessarily I have. And so there is going to be a need, as we see currently in New York City, where it is currently a free-for-all with people trying to open up any store and saying and just selling cannabis out the door. There has to be an ethos and ethics that the FDA or somebody needs to bring to the legitimacy of the industry itself, because we've tried self-policing and we have to an extent. However, we still have to, look at the full scope of things. So I would say Schedule 5. So from here, I'm going to go to Debbie.
So I just wanted to say, kind of from, not just from a business point of view, because I'm not a business person, but if you think about where we're at with our current state models, we already have medical conditions, meaning the state's list of approved conditions. We already have access through some sort of system that the state has to qualify patients. And we have some level of product control with labeling and manufacturing through various levels of GMP or lack thereof. So, I mean, I would argue, what would be the incentive for someone to go after the FDA process at any level, whether it's Schedule 2 or 5? I mean, to bring a new drug to market is $1 billion in 10 plus years. And from that, you get patent protection, you get market exclusivity. What is the incentive for anybody when we've already got this system in place to go after this very expensive FDA drug approval process? Thank you.
No, and that's a real point because I mean, and that cost $1 billion by 2011 standards. So now with the advertising budgets alone, they're almost $1 billion for some of these companies. So for some of these drugs, almost exclusively. So it's, yeah, it's a very interesting conundrum that we have to wrap our heads around. We're going to go to Councilmember George Armstrong.
Thank you, Etienne, and thank you, Debbie, for joining us. Not sure if I missed it. Where was the leading killer in our country for drugs? Where was alcohol on that list? Oh, that's right. That's right. It's not on the list. And you know why? Because socially and economically, it's way different than all the drugs on the list. And I'm here saying my vote is the same for cannabis. It doesn't belong on the list. It doesn't, for all the reasons we just talked about. But certainly if you can put a drug like alcohol that has caused more pain and suffering in our country, there is no competition on the block, guys. I don't know if you know that, but you can stack the heroin and the cocaine misery, and it still won't add up to what alcohol has done to our country. And I still think everybody should have the right to use an alcohol who's an adult. And so I truly believe that because it's so different than the things that are scheduled, that descheduling is really my only option. I can't see it working any other way because it is socially, like, none of those drugs, let's think about that for a second. None of those drugs are social drugs like alcohol and cannabis that are on that. Nobody gets together to drink cough syrup or to take Tylenol 3. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. But I think descheduling, certainly Schedule 5 is the only thing that I feel can be debated on an honest level if we look at the facts and what they base everything on. But my vote would go for descheduling. And thanks for joining us again, Debbie.
And let's go to our resident nurse on hand, Marilyn Mathry. Response.
Hey, hi Debbie as well. Been a while. Yeah, I would agree with Wade and George that Schedule 5, when we talk about cannabis, the plant, not Schedule 5, excuse me, descheduling, when we're talking about the plant, because the plant should be to the point of descheduling in that anyone can grow it, whether you want it for food or medicine or just the beauty of the plant, the smell of the plant, whatever you may like about the plant, any of us should be able to grow it, no problems. But for consumer protection, when you're talking about selling it, again, the plant, people may want to sell products at a farmer's market. That's, treat it like any other vegetable in that regard. But when you do get to products that are made, somehow we want to have some assurance. So Schedule 5 does make sense, more or less over the counter, where that they're following good manufacturing policies as anything. I did have a question, Debbie. I'm kind of wondering, I probably should know this, but I don't. To what extent do herbal preparations in a health food store have to get FDA approval?
So that's a good
No,
question.
you know,
And it's, yeah, it's nice to hear from you again, Marilyn. So those are controlled two ways. They are either generally recognized as safe, and there's a monograph that is being followed so that there's some labeling requirements. There might be some testing requirements, but and there's also it's very strict as far as what kind of you can't make any form and function claims. You can't make any medical claims. But the FDA does oversee those. Now, to what level do they enforce and review? Drugs and devices have always been their highest priority. So when it comes to resources, that's where the resources are going to go. But they do technically have oversight.
All right, so there is some oversight there. Mary Lynn, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, that was curious you said that, because you also reminded me, you guys remember the monograph by the, what is it? American Herbal Association or something. I can't remember, but it was years back, and they made it about the plant, and they were supposed to have volume 2 that was more on the clinical applications. I don't know that it ever came out.
It didn't.
Does it?
Roy
it
lost
did?
his budget for that project. If
Oh,
you know,
bummer. I know that he was struggling because they needed consensus and they couldn't get 100% consensus of the authors. Isn't that sad? So they've got the monograph talking about this plant, how to label it, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to actually using it, the clinical applications, they ran out of money, so they never finished it.
Well, there's a
Oh.
new monograph, Mary Lynn, that is out currently that we spoke to her early on, that is actually taking recommendations until December. So that one is current. So there is a different monograph that we are speaking toward in this discussion. All right, going to Michael Krawitz.
Thanks, Etienne. I wanted to keep that little discussion and sort of dissertation about Schedule 3 and Marinol separate from what I believe that we should be at, but I wanted to answer that and kind of, talk to that really quick. What I think we should do, and when I start talking about, and when we start talking about what we think we should do, I think that almost automatically goes back to Congress. This isn't a matter of scheduling, it's a matter of law. And first of all, it's a lot more than just the schedule. There's a lot of bad criminal law that needs to be changed and repealed and reformed at the federal level. That is not just the schedule alone of cannabis. Descheduling is really just the start of what we want and what we want to see. We want to see cannabis available to veterans. We want to see veterans be able to grow cannabis as a occupational therapy in the VA facilities. So that's what we want. But as far as what we can get right now, that's another interesting question. And I think is what I want is what we can get right now and what is, compelled by the law. And we wrote a letter to the Attorney General very strongly saying that we felt that this change in the treaty status of cannabis, making cannabis more mainstream as a medicine worldwide, also mandated the federal government of the United States, due to our federal law, which calls for just such a thing. It says that the Justice Department shall issue an order pending a change in the schedule placement. Well, the change in schedule at the international level happened 2 years later. Nothing had happened. So we started knocking on the walls and got someone at the Office of National Drug Control Policy who assured us they'd run our letter over to justice and find out what's going on. We didn't realize the President of the United States was going to hand carry it, but that's kind of how it worked out. But here we are nonetheless. And I think, you got to be fair, and cannabis wasn't removed from control at the international level, but it was down scheduled. If their argument before was 1 and 2, the argument now should be 1 through 5. The DEA and the State Department should be saying, as long as we schedule it somewhere in the United States, we're complying with the treaty. And if they say that, I'll agree with them, because we didn't completely deschedule it from the treaty. The treaty change doesn't in and of itself qualify for descheduling. But certainly with so many states dealing with cannabis as an over-the-counter item, the federal government is caught in a very uncomfortable position where if it wants to go with the law, the states, the facts, the evidence, the patients, even common sense and decency, and I'll even go one step further, being able to have prevention and treatment services and youth protection and societal protection and all these things that are spoken of by anti-marijuana, but they don't ever show up at the table to implement these things when we actually roll up our sleeves to do it. Well, that's what we want. And that all can happen, I think, very, very quickly with Schedule 5. And we'll see, but I think it can. So that's what I think should happen right now, given the change in the treaty. Literally change with an order from the Justice Department that says something like, given the change in the treaty, we have discussed this and we now feel that Schedule 5 is appropriate. I think that the FDA should come back with the same thing that they came back with on CBD, which was that it shouldn't be scheduled at all. And the DEA should come back with exactly what they came back with CBD, which was that we're in the treaty, we should schedule it somewhere. And they relented on CBD because of the Farm Act and because of the change in the treaty and because of the World Health Organization evaluations of CBD. It's complicated stuff. But here we are. This is where we're at. Schedule 5, I think, is appropriate by law of the United States now. And it may take a year or two before we get through the Senate and the House and get a bill to the president. If that happens in a lucky fashion, that's a year, at least a year off. So now, like within a few months, we can have Schedule 5.
Marilyn Mathry, you had a follow-up.
Yeah, Michael, with you saying that, that is curious. But, I think they could also say they're staying within the treaty if they put the plant descheduled, and then because the treaty did, it just downregulated cannabis and put cannabis products, things that people are buying from someone, in a Schedule 5. And I guess my point is, somewhere or another, that plant should just be allowed to grow. I mean, not only because it doesn't qualify, but I mean, this is a plant that's highly beneficial to not only people, but the planet. And again, any restriction on this plant it's just contrary to common sense, health, individual health, but planetary health. We should be able to grow this plant. It is such a benefit. And I'm just talking, whether it be hemp and or cannabis. The idea that they're going to restrict that is just nuts. And so I think you can stay with the schedule by saying, yeah, we'll downregulate any cannabis products that's sold that somehow processed as a Schedule 5. It would make sense.
Well, it always rings in my ear when I hear it, when we talk about drug scheduling, I hear Al Burns say in my head, it's a plant. It's a plant. So, Al, where do you see it? Because it is a plant, but, they have these treaties and scheduling. So, what are your thoughts?
Well, I won't say that. I will say I agree with Mary Lynn. She must have been listening to me years ago. I think what we're headed for, or what we want to be headed for, is a bifurcated system. In that it's a plant. I heard Corinne Millett, one of the first original federal patients, say that in 1990 in our original film about marijuana as a medicine. It's a plant, Al. What the fuck's wrong with it? It's a plant. So as a plant, it needs to be, as Marilyn indicated, available to grow in your backyard as a commercial product for hemp or oil or food, as you wish. On the other hand, the bifurcation comes in my mind is that you know, I trust the farmers of America, but if I'm going to take this stuff as a medicine, I want to buy it from ETN. And I want ETN have gone through the process of telling me what's in it, of testing it for impurities, of packaging it correctly, of having the expertise to tell me as a novice medical cannabis user how to use the stuff, dose, etc. So I propose that V.A.C. consider a bifurcated program that includes no schedule, as Wade indicates, or a schedule, and I would be okay with 5. I might even be okay with 4, as long as what we're talking about is for medicinal use and the purity that requirement entertains.
Thank you. That's very succinct and very at-break. So I appreciate that. And we're going to go to our next question, which will come from Council Member Wade Laughter.
Yeah, thank you. I love the depth of this conversation, so I want to throw something out that I'm also looking forward to hearing what y'all got to say. Should we continue to arrest people in 38 states with medical cannabis and 18 states that have recreational cannabis while we're still waiting for rescheduling? And to go to one of the things that we've discussed before, a veteran or a patient traveling from California, for example, going on a vacation, passing through Idaho, is subject to arrest for having their medicine with them. That don't seem right. And I don't know how to change that any quicker than rescheduling. Suggestions?
All right. Who would like to respond to this question first off? Please raise your hands. Anyone? All right. Anyone raising a hand? No responses?
George
I
has
can
his hand
jump
up.
in real quick.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Nate.
Sorry about the noise. I'm in Louisiana, visiting my girlfriend's family, and there's a dinner, but I snuck out because I missed you guys. I think that ending arrest needs to end, like figuring out how regulating businesses and testing and all that. Let's figure that out. But if there's an imaginary line between states, and in one state you don't go to prison anymore, and in the other one you do, and it's literally a line, you can see the person on the other side. I just don't get it. And this should be something on the forefront. This is something that we've seen initiatives on local levels. So let's say in Texas, Austin, they've decriminalized it. So it's the lowest priority. So there's stuff that we can do, especially on a low level, on our local level. We don't have that many federal arrests anymore. Like, it's pretty rare, as we've learned. So I'd say it's really, really prudent that we stop it and just strategize, all of us on our local level. You can get a ballot initiative on your city if you want to, and arrest should start. It should stop. No one should ever get arrested for this again.
All right. Councilmember George Armstrong.
Yeah, I think definitely the answer is no. Nobody in any state should be getting arrested for the medicine. So, and I think we all feel that way, obviously. But I think Wade's right that the quickest way to get there, and Michael's right, when we were talking about the last question, probably the quickest way to get there is a rescheduling. But I think this brings up the reason that federal action has to happen. I would respectfully disagree with Nate. I feel that they've made us we've already won 38 fights or whatever it is to win some type of medical cannabis. At some point during prohibition of alcohol, the federal government had to do something when the same thing happened. And I feel that we're at that point right now. And it's going to take federal action to stop people in states like Texas and Nebraska from being arrested. So, and I'll leave it at that.
Councilmember Tony Landry.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Debbie, for joining us. I just so many good points made tonight about cannabis, being a plant, and then how the international treaty was mainly brought in to regulate pharmaceutical compounds and that and synthesized medicine and this plant. Everybody born onto the earth, it should be, it should be an inherent right. All the plants are accessible for us. I mean, if it was some dangerous thing, but we just talked about all the other scheduling, how some of the cannabis is Schedule 1, and then you have these states like Louisiana, the health department is in control of cannabis program, and they're packaging it and putting it out to all these, to not all 9 dispensaries, but and yet they have the capability of giving an exemption to cannabis's scheduling of being Schedule 1, and I think the governor should put a moratorium in until the federal government does a review and says, yeah, okay, this is it. But until then, right now, because we're running these programs in 38 states, I think all of the states should stop arresting for cannabis right now until we figure it out on the federal level. But and then we should have a parallel marketplace with small micro growers able to take care of us. A little few plants, a small footprint. You can't just have licenses, that cost $1 million operation to sell cannabis and still keep it Schedule 1 and arresting, marginalized citizens that can't afford to buy into the system. You're going to have some kind of parallel marketplace with some guidelines, some safety guidelines, but that's my 2 cents on that. But it's great conversation, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Councilmember Krowitz.
Thanks, ATN. This conversation tonight, in a very direct way, grew out of the kind of the conversations that we had in our work meetings, Veterans Action Council, about President Biden's pardon statements and pardoning federal cases that involve just simple marijuana possession. But interestingly, he also called upon state governors to also pardon simple marijuana possession charges. And I'm just sort of reveling in the fallout of this. Watching the news cycle is just endless on the subject, and it seems to all be very good, very productive conversations, very productive news reports and stuff. I've just been incredibly impressed. But at its core, it's really interesting how this kind of worked out. In Virginia, the effort to decriminalize marijuana started with a legislator trying to expunge old records. He had a member come into his office that couldn't get a federal job, and he tried to do an expungement bill. And basically, the expungement bill wouldn't fly. What he really needed to do was do a decrim bill. And then, of course, that's what happened, and that was a big part of our history of our marijuana reform in Virginia. But I think it's just such a strange thing. Like, somehow the idea of pardoning people for marijuana offenses, simple marijuana offenses, prior marijuana offenses, seems so innocuous and so easy and just so doable to people, I guess, that haven't really thought through the full dimensions of marijuana reform and understand the problems as we do. But it seems to be a great gateway for them to lead them into this Pandora's box of ours on drug policy, because you can't pardon people for prior offenses and be still arresting people for the same offense. That creates a quandary that I think is quite productive to our ends. And the thing is that right now we got, I think, already 3 different governors that were responding. It's like North Carolina and Kentucky, and I think also Puerto Rico were already responding to President Biden's request. So we'll see where this leads. It's a fascinating detail. But with regard to the states, just one last thing I'll say is that alcohol prohibition, as I understand it, essentially ended with the states not enforcing the law. The federal government is a tiny portion of our marijuana enforcement. I think that's a big fact that you need to kind of put into this mix. When the president's pardoning marijuana offenders at the federal level, it's a tiny number of the people that have been arrested in this country for simple possession. By not, and the states can't violate federal law, but they don't have to enforce it either. That's our Constitution. So the states can actually just stop enforcing these marijuana laws and leave it all up to the federal government. And that's what breaks the back of the federal prohibition. That's what worked in alcohol prohibition. People believe that would work in states doing that for marijuana prohibition. That's where the plan to go into the states and do marijuana initiatives came from, and the big effort that we did as a movement towards that end, which I think has worked exactly that way. Although it's still going, and it will eventually get to the point where the federal government is the only game in town enforcing marijuana laws if they push it that far. But yeah, states need to roll back the laws. But one last little thing I'd leave you with is, in California, we're working on things right now to try to help the people in the cannabis industry, especially craft growers, small cannabis growers growing a very great product, but having a real hard time of it these days because of the high taxes, because of all the costs of being in the business, etc. And if they're not in the actual loop, if they're not paying their taxes and following all the rules, as onerous as they are, it makes it very difficult to help them. And I think that's just something I'll throw into this mix, is as we get more and more towards legal, those that are still being illegal are going to be harder and harder for us to reach, I think, is the way I would put it.
Yes, and on top of that, I want to reiterate what you're saying. Today we saw Kentucky with the Bashir encouraging Kentuckians with misdemeanor charges for marijuana possession to apply for a pardon. So that's today. So people are responding, as you said. There's 3 states now. But exactly what Tony and others were saying, the states right now can call for the stop of arresting. Right now, this is what they can literally do. They can stop the prosecution, tell their law enforcement to stop. Now, as an avid on patrol live addict, which is the new cops, I like to watch the police and see what they're doing and learn from them. And they're still using the smell of cannabis to, arrest people and to get into their car and to harass them. So, this would take a large swath out of their tools so they could actually focus on real crimes, as opposed to utilizing this as a crutch to find other ways to gather revenues for their local areas, police departments, etc. So this is an act currently the governors could be doing, and with the president calling these types of pardons, this type of reflection back would, I think, cause a great deal of change. It could cause a domino effect. Mary Lynn.
Yeah, I didn't think about, I was thinking about pardoning, but what you brought up, Wade, regarding just the arrests of going cross borders. With what Biden said, it seems like we could get a federal law that just basically says, any patient traveling through the United States, no state can issue, if it's a patient, no state can arrest them. Obviously, you'd hope every state goes along with Biden and says, let's pardon any of the ones who've already committed some crime. But darn well, in some of those states, and I'm thinking of the southern states, they love that tool of arresting, the black folk or whatever, and they don't want to give that up easily. And so we're going to have stubborn states that are going to try hang on to their rights and, bust you for the smell of marijuana, all that kind of bullshit. But it seems like there could be some kind of law federally, because as a patient, you have to be able to take your medicine if you're going to go visit grandma, kid's going to go off to college. Something's happening where you're out of your state, where you are a legitimate patient. and then all of a sudden you're going to get arrested in another one for having your medicine. It seems like they can do that, but yeah, the sad part is in many states, the police love the cannabis prohibition as a weapon, and however we can get that. I think that's where the public comes in handy, and we as a force to really help people understand the nastiness of the prohibition in some states, how that is so used to control people.
Debbie.
My 2 cents.
Real quickly, I'm not an attorney, but I was listening to a group yesterday, and I understand that pardoning does not equate to expungement. So a pardon is a nice thing to do, but unless you expunge the record, you're still going to have this record. And I don't know how far pardoning is really going to go to achieve what we want.
That's a very good point. That's a very good legal point.
Right.
Councilmember Alburn.
Yeah, well, let's all just maybe this and maybe that. We'll see how it all turns out. But I would like to remind folks of you guys were introduced to John Getman a month or so ago. He's been around with me for a long, long time. John did a study of the arrests in the United States of America, and he did it over a 20-year period. It was 20 years, but he did it every year, okay? And what he found out, and I'm going to be a little off the number, but what he found out was somewhere around 85 to 90% of the arrests for marijuana cannabis possession in the United States occurred in 10 counties, not states, counties. Now, the counties were pretty obvious when you look at it. You can think about control, as Mary Lynn indicated. This was all about money, because the counties, you can see them: Myrtle Beach, Daytona Beach, Panama City, Florida. Anywhere that people would gather to recreate, to have a good time, to party, like spring break. Man, I'll tell you what, those goddamn counties could make their whole goddamn budget in 10 days. So don't be misled with all this stuff about federal and state. That's not the way it has gone down. Now, we can get a hold of John again, or just look his shit up somewhere, but that's how it was. And I can't imagine that it's changed that much. So I agree with everybody. This thing about Biden, he's bullshit. Look, that guy and Harris, I've said this before, they've locked up as a couple more people in the history of the world than any other couple in the history of the world. And she ought to be ashamed of herself. She's a brown girl and she's locking up black people like they were just her slaughter. They're a terrible couple to be even discussing the war on drugs with, because as far as I'm concerned, they are the war on drugs in our political thing. But again, we start talking about arresting people, we should not, of course. I agree totally with Tony. Good question. That's the answer. But think about where those arrests are coming from, and we may be able to concentrate there and embarrass, inform, something.
Wow, that's might as well drop the mic after that one, Al. That was a great breakdown, as well as some straight truths there that need to be heard. Next up is Council Member George Armstrong with our next question.
Okay, so the president directed the AG and HHS to look into this. That usually means that there's going to be some kind of committee formed or whatever. That's going to take time. In the meantime, we're going to have a brand new Congress in a few months. Do we think Congress is going to do something before this gets legs with what Biden has planned, with some of the stuff we saw on the Hill? Or do we think that we're in it for the long haul? Because I would suspect that if we wait for it to go through this process, it's going to be by the end of the next Congress, I would say. So I will phrase it that way.
All right, Debbie will be the first one to take this question.
Okay, I'm again stepping out of my lane because I'm also not a politician, but if you just look at the facts, the House has voted what, at least 6 times on various cannabis bills and voted and passed them. Nothing has even basically come to a committee meeting in the Senate. So I think as long as we've got the Senate as the barrier, we're a long way off from Congress doing anything.
More truth coming to our ears. Councilmember Wade, laughter.
Yeah, thank you, Chen. It occurs to me that I'm not sure we really want Congress to do anything. Legislation is a really terrible way to bring about change, and we're talking pretty fundamental change. It seems to me if they were going to do any, I mean, I just look at California. We had 20 years of an attempt at a legal framework that actually worked pretty good for the people it was intended for, patients. It really did. Prop 215 allowed a model that actually served the needs of patients, brought at least some kind of compliance, people trying to pay taxes and whatnot. I mean, it was not nearly as problematic, at least for patients, as the current California system is, which was created by a combination of legislation and law passed by the vote of the people. I really think descheduling is probably the friendliest way for the feds to stop, to just, like we've been talking about, take the heat off of arresting people for this plant or possession of their medicine. And meantime, my goodness, that's all I got for the moment. I'm sure there's more going on in my head, but I gotta have another puff. Blessed be.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I agree that having Congress do anything regarding laws around cannabis has not necessarily been at our best behest, and I'm cautionary after spending time up there speaking with them about what they would come up with after hearing what they will come up with and trying to interject and intercede as well as being intermediaries that we became. So it's a deft dance and one that we will have to maintain our seat at the table, thus not ending up on the menu, which we have to definitely maintain. But we have to most importantly maintain patients and patients' rights and patients' access, as well as home grow and home grow access. Councilmember Al Byrne.
Well, Wade, you put your hand right there on, to me, part of the major problem is, as you indicated, California, using your example, has actually had a deterioration of patient whatever over a 20-year period. Well, who made those decisions about patient care? Come on, cops, lawyers, senators, representatives, what the fuck do they know?
The market did.
So,
No question.
So I'm saying, I'm with Wade. Do we need the Senate? It actually appears to me, if we can believe anything these bastards say, is that they are shifting their honorable out of this mess over to the Food and Drug Administration. And it could be that the V.A.C. should enter a conversation with those people. And not too worry about what the Congress does, because, like I said, they don't know anything anyway. But with the one thing we have going at the FDA is that some of them are actually doctors and researchers that might understand what we're talking about and may listen, like we have had experience, Mike and I have had with the VA. So I would want you to consider those thoughts.
Councilmember Michael Krawitz.
Thanks, Etienne. I did a lot of info tables over the years. For those who are not aware of what info tables might be, when I think about getting in the trenches and working in the cannabis movement, one of the things that I think about is standing at an informational table for 8 hours or 10 hours or a couple of days and distributing information. We'd have the tables covered with bits and pieces of peer-reviewed journal articles, newspaper articles, magazine articles, book clips and bits and pieces of information that altogether helped to tell the story that we were trying to tell at whatever point in time we were doing those tables. And over time, I was asked a lot of questions about, what legalization would look like. And I gave a couple of different answers, it seems to me, over the years. One of them was that legalization was going to happen when the mainstream news was giving news reports talking about how the prohibition of marijuana made the situation worse. That somehow they not only that they didn't support prohibition anymore, but they were actually arguing actively against it, basically. And then the other one that I gave was this idea that instead of just one or two bills in Congress, that you'd have dozens of bills in Congress. That when you have something that gets ready to actually get passed, you don't have just one bill ever. There's a whole bunch. If you look at anything that's ever got passed, there's usually a pretty good number, sort of a constellation of different bits and pieces of legislation around that before one gets passed. At least from my simple, naive look at Congress, that's the way it seems to be. And only recently are we actually getting to that point where we have lots of different bills. However, look who has carried those bills. I mean, Kamala Harris was a prosecutor and all that, but she was also a senator that carried a marijuana bill. And the marijuana bills right now in Congress all deschedule. All the main bills all deschedule as a starting point. I think that's where we're at. I think the only discussion and argument in Congress is how do we do this in a fair and equitable way? How do we create equity? How do we do righteous service and respect to those who've been damaged by the drug war? And that becomes a big argument at this point in moving forward, evidently, within the ranks. However, you have the main people in both the House and the Senate carrying bills. Schumer is the Senate leader and is named on this major piece of marijuana legislation. And President Biden just basically, in a way, put a flag up saying, hey, I'm open to talk about marijuana at this point. I think we're closer to a bill getting out of Congress. I think that this next set of elections and the one after that sort of dictate the course of what's going to happen on marijuana policy. In Virginia, when the Democratic Party took over all the aspects of government just for a couple of years, we moved 30 years of marijuana legislation in 2 years. So look at what's going to happen in this next couple of elections, and we'll see what happens with marijuana policy, I think, at the federal level. This is what I think.
Councilmember Landry.
Yeah, this was I had question 4. I don't know if we overlooked it or not, but I think it kind of goes along with what we're talking about now, how, the federal government's been given disinformation about cannabis for so many years. And it was admitted that the whole purpose of putting it on Schedule 1 was to go after the anti-war left and African Americans. All this data is out there. And, like a pharmaceutical, whenever it's approved, we get bombarded by commercials on TV, that putting out there. But I was wondering, like, for cannabis, do you feel it's the government's responsibility or to put out public service announcements on maybe the endocannabinoid system to try and lower the the stigma and the arrest and that in the U.S.? Do you feel like it should be because the cannabis is kind of like, it's not like a pharmaceutical. They didn't spend millions of dollars to develop it, and they don't want to put the word out. In fact, in Louisiana, you can't advertise for cannabis. You can't have a dispensary like 15 miles away. They got to be 15 miles away from each other, but you can have a CVS and a Walgreens right across the street, putting out opiates. So it's like we have all these things with this, coming from a point of disinformation and 5 decades of oppression, and arrest and all this stuff is in our leadership's head, and I was appalled at some of the people we met with in DC, and then even in Louisiana, when you ask them if they know anything about the endocannabinoid system, they just look at you like a blank stare. Like they never heard of it, but yet they're devising policy that affects all of our lives. So I thought, why not? Do you feel like is that up to the government to kind of address that on a nationwide level, is try and put out some public service announcements about how the benefits of cannabis?
Councilmember Alburn.
Jody, no. I don't want the feds involved in this shit. I've been fighting these fuckers for 40 years, and they will lie until they're dead. I don't want them to educate anybody. I would like higher education to educate the medical people, and everybody else will fall in line. I believe I'm a capitalist. I am. I believe in the system. I defended it. I fought for it, and it has proven to be pretty damn good. So I'm not worried. Mike's got all these concerns. Mike Kravitz, he's always like this. He's got all these details he's worried about, and what's going to happen 3 years from now. I don't give a fuck. What I care about is that 60, 70, 80 guys and girls a day are offing themselves. And we got to stop that. That's what we really have to stop. And that means we've got to get the FDA or whoever the hell's going to pull the strings to pull the damn strings. There's no sense going back to the courts. We've done that shit. Many bills in Congress. Well, fuck, there've been many bills in Congress in my lifetime. None of them ever been worth a shit. And even if they are bills, what do they say? What do they do? And how's it going to work? And how long is it going to take to get them in place? No, we're going to do this different. This has got to be not a commando raid, nothing like that. This has just got to be, we got to go. The V.A.C. It's like the guy that wrote The Art of Warfare. I can't quote him right now, and that Chinese guy, but he was brilliant. And what he said in a sentence was, if you're fighting your enemy and he's looking for you to go over here, then you go over there. We got to go there. We got to find out where the weak spot is right now in this government. It's not the Congress. It's not the AG's office. There's a weak spot. We got to find it. Might be the FDA. But again, I would like you to think about out of the box here a little bit. We haven't got time for this. And we are at a point where the president of the United States, bullshit that he said, meaningless of what he said, but he said something. That's the first time I've heard the president of the United States say anything about medical marijuana or marijuana since Jimmy Carter. That was a long time ago. So anyway, enough. Next.
That was Sun Tzu and the Art of War. Wade Laughter, you're recognized.
Great stuff. And yeah, The Art of War is definitely worth reading if you haven't. I think it was Tony who was suggesting government funding for public service announcements. Like Al, I'm not a big fan of the federal government getting involved in that kind of messaging, but I couldn't help but think of I saw a commercial, a 60-second commercial that a Colorado dispensary, I think, did, and it featured a woman, a mother of children, and a delivery service brought, she was having a hellish day, and delivery service brought her a little package, and she had a joint, and everything got better, and it was nice music. Beautifully done, 60-second spot. I could see more of those that included information about the ECS, trying to undo, let's have the cannabis industry start putting funding into that kind of stuff. Just saying. I'm a patient. I care a lot about it.
ECS, for those who aren't paying attention to the endocannabinoid system, we military folk and our acronyms, so for the you lay people, just making you aware. Debbie, you're up next.
I just want to make sure we are on question 4, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
One of the things I think the federal government has to stop doing immediately, and I'm not even talking about just positive education, but they've got to stop doing what the NIH has been doing for 50 years, which, as Nora Vokal has recently said again, they only talk about the negative issues. Their educational platform is the harms, and the money they give out for study grants are to study harms. It has never been about therapeutic potential. So we've got to make sure that we've got the NIH on board to stop talking about just the harms of this, even if they're just neutral. That's a step that the federal government could take right now, because people listen to her, unfortunately, and they also realize that this information very easily becomes the educational platform just by virtue of the fact that it's coming from the NIH. Thank you.
Very well stated. Thank you very much for that. Councilmember Crowitz.
Yes, thanks. I meant to throw in about the media. I still haven't seen the mainstream media, full on go after prohibition yet. But I did see what you might call the secondary media do that. I was really pleased the other day. A really good, I guess, small media company that follows the news headlines and goes into them in a little more depth, was talking about the anti-marijuana statements of Fox News' Laura Ingraham, and just horrible stuff that she was saying. And he was rebutting it, and she said something about wanting to legalize all drugs, and I didn't really have any thought about where he was going to go in kind of answering that, but he went to, okay, let's go down that rabbit hole. What if we want to legalize all drugs? And he used Portugal's example, and he showed Transform, which is our great organization out of the UK that's done some really great documentation on legalizing drugs. They had a whole document on the Portugal drug policy, and they started out with a horrendous overdose and opiate outcomes, decriminalized drugs and implemented harm reduction, and now have very impressive numbers, very impressive, much lower than anything that we have. So there you go. I think that's the kind of argument you see that in the mainstream news, and that won't be that far off. I think we're not that far off before this thing will face that kind of what do you call it, critical mass, I'd call it.
Councilmember Alburn.
Hey, Debbie, I'm the storyteller here. And I don't know about the NIH, but a number of years ago, I got a call from an executive at NIDA. And what she wanted, curiously enough, for their museum was a couple of federal cannabis cans. They ship them out to the federal patients, or they used to, virtually on left. But anyway, they wanted to fill the cans so they could put them in their museum, and I arranged for that to happen for them, and they were nice. But I asked this lady, I said, sort of to your point, Debbie, I said, you guys, every time you do a study, you're looking for the negatives. And she said, listen, we work for the government, and our charter is to study drug abuse. And that's the only thing we're ever going to study. And what you do is what you do, but it'll never be what we do. So again, the federal government has their standards, and they're not like you and me, Debbie. They're way different.
All right. Our next question will come from Councilmember Michael Crowitz.
And I'm absolutely not ready. Totally off in left field, sitting here just daydreaming about poppy fields. What do we want, I think was the question, wasn't it?
Yes.
What do we want?
Yeah, what would we want?
What would we want? I'll start this off because I'll tell you, this has been a fascinating thing for me. It's underlined everything I've ever done with cannabis. In its simplest form, you have a conundrum. you have a age-old plant, the plant that has roots in ancient African culture and history, ancient Chinese culture and history, ancient Indian culture and history. I'm talking going back thousands upon thousands of years. The first written books talking about it, the first pharmacopoeias mentioning it, the first medicine people employing it. So that's what we're talking about here. And to really take full advantage of this plant, back in the day, around 1850 or so, I'd say 1890, 1900 was sort of the heyday of Western curiosity about cannabis as a medicine. And what's his name there? Dr. O'Shaughnessy came out with some great documentation on cannabis for the Queen. I think he was a Scottish doctor working for the Queen of England. And that was, I think, even connected to this huge report that was done as the Indian Hemp Commission report, which is like this huge multi-volume tome on the basically taking the knowledge base of this ancient plant and converting it to Western, language and understanding. And we've actually, at that point, we had very sophisticated hemp and hemp applications, and we had attempts at, I don't know, about 100, 150 different cannabis medicinal products. That's not nothing, but that's still nothing compared to what we can do with this. And the problem that I see is with our modern way of doing things, we've complained about it a lot. The FDA likes to see things in terms of just single molecules and applying those carefully in very known ways. And that's not cannabis. Cannabis is a complex plant that occurs in a whole different amount of varieties that all seem to have different benefits to the cannabis medical patient, as well as different appeal to the cannabis market. And it's very difficult to take that and put it into a pharmacy bottle and give it to the patients in the millions in that kind of scale. What seems to apply best is sort of this apothecary model of ancient China, where you have someone behind the counter that knows what's in each and every little drawer, knows where it was grown, knows how it's applied, has all kinds of different stories and anecdotes from other patients that have used it, and basically can impart that almost like oral history to the next generation of patients. And that's not how our pharmacy system work in the West. So that's our conundrum, really, in a nutshell. I think that we can, have some generalized products that will be very useful, and they'll be out fairly soon. Think Sativex and that kind of line of thing. But those are minimally useful. If I took Sativex, Epidiolex, all these products that are in the pipeline, and put them in a modern dispensary in California or Oregon or Colorado, and let the patients decide between those and all the other products there, they might not even get picked at all. So, we need to really work hard, I think, as a society, as a human race, to try to take these benefits and actually make them beneficial for the mass society and not lose that. But those of us that have been on the inside and have seen what this can do, when you can actually have that one-to-one experience where people can really apply this knowledge in a social construct, almost a tribal setting, we've had phenomenal results.
Next up will be Debbie.
So, Michael, I guess I would try to answer your question, what do we want, from a more fundamental point of view. Have any of you been following what ASA is going to propose as far as this concept of a Schedule 6? I was allowed to review their draft bill before it went into final form. I don't even know when I don't even know if they have any sponsors. I mean, I really don't know from that point of view where it's at as far as just completion. But the concept really is to create a separate Schedule 6 just for cannabis, but then to rely very heavily on the state programs. And I think it's worth giving some consideration.
Can you go more into that understanding about what that Schedule 6 would involve? Would this be basically a cannabis-specific scheduling? What does that
Yes.
entail?
I mean, that's at least what Americans for Safe Access is proposing in this draft legislation that they have actually prepared. So they would create, like, just like the Center for Tobacco Products, they would call for a creation of a Center for Cannabis Products within the FDA's reach, but they would have limited authority as far as you know, what the day-to-day logistics would look like, reverting most of that to the states. Michael, I see your hand is up, so I'm going to let you take over because I'm just about out of my knowledge as far as Schedule 6 goes.
Well, it's funny. I just went down this rabbit hole the other day just because I was trying to figure out if there was anything about Schedule 6 in the federal system, and there isn't, until such a bill is put in or passed, there isn't. But there are a couple of states that I found that had Schedule 6. And the way they worded it was those things in Schedule 1 that basically the way they had it was I can't remember the exact wording, but I can remember the thing, and it'll explain it completely when you understand. They were talking about like huffing paint or sniffing glue. So it's something that it wasn't necessarily even a drug or a drug substance, otherwise not in the schedules, but that could be for certain purposes deadly and to be seen as a drug, and that was Schedule 6. So that's remember from my little bit of research, that's what I found was the Schedule 6 that does exist was really applying to huffing and that kind of stuff. It's a very creative way to create a sort of a safety valve for Schedule 1. But I just don't see that. I mean, I see that as being one of the many bills in a constellation of bills that forces us to eventually pass something, but I don't see that as the thing that gets passed. Let me answer it that way.
I agree. I don't even know if it has any sponsors at this point.
No, and I did hear about it when we were speaking with some very interesting and influential cannabis people on the Hill on both the House and Senate side. So, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Council member Mary Lynn Mathry.
Yeah, Schedule 6, interesting. Michael, if they're meaning it for like huffing, that's kind of crazy because you'd think Schedule 6 is even less dangerous. Some of those things aren't too swift. But about 5 years ago, to my dismay, I had stepped off the board of the American Cannabis Nurses Association. And yeah, it was before the 2016 election. I think, yeah, it was that. Anyway, we wanted ACNA to put out a paper calling for the descheduling of cannabis. And at the time, the president at the time said, well, no, I'm not sure because I'm not sure what the membership thinks. And I thought, well, that's crazy. How could any cannabis nurse not think that it should be descheduled? So she was going to, so they proposed, well, we'll discuss it at your conference. So it was going to be discussed at the Berkeley conference in 2017. Well, okay. I thought, well, that'll be interesting. We can discuss it at the conference, if we should deschedule or not, and if we should write some paper up. And then it became closer. The conference, I think, was going to be in April or May, and about February, they said, "Oh, we decided we're not going to discuss it at the conference. We're just going to have a meeting, an open meeting for the membership." And it was very upsetting to me, obviously, and to the founding members of the ACNA, thinking, what's going on with you? So the next thing we saw is they sent out a survey to the membership. And the survey was, 1, do you think the ACNA should take a stand on descheduling? Yes or no? And 2, if you do, what schedule do you think it should go in? And they could pick 1 through 6. They created a Schedule 6. And it was like, oh, it was just for cannabis, but somehow it was going to be regulated. And I wasn't the only one. Many of us were just like, what the heck is that? the idea that rather than just deschedule it, you would want to create Schedule 6. Do you know how long it would take for them to figure out what really would be Schedule 6 and the process of doing that? And why do you want to add some kind of control over cannabis? So I don't know. They eventually, so in the survey, they didn't have the choice of descheduling. That's what was so upsetting about the survey. It was which schedule should it be? And I ended up saying 6, but I wrote in the comments, where is my option to deschedule? But based on that, they were going to put a paper out recommending cannabis be put in Schedule 6. And I was like, oh, you can't do that. That survey was inappropriate because you didn't have all the choices there. They did write a paper. They didn't release it publicly. And then somewhere along the line, they decided they better redo the survey, and they had the descheduling option in there. And that one was the one that was voted and passed on. So that's curious. That's the first time hearing that ASA is now proposing a Schedule 6. I just think that's crazy. Why add more confusion? Deschedule the plant, give the other products, just like you can get Lamodal over the counter if you got diarrhea, or Robitussin with a little codeine in it for cough. The people can go to a dispensary and get cannabis or someplace, and the hope is that the products are somehow regulated to make sure their source is good, the process of making it is good, and the labeling is accurate. You need the consumer safety stuff. So that's, to me, the only regulation you need.
Councilmember Michael Krawitz.
Yeah, I can hear Kenzie in the back of my head talking about pepper, capsicum, capsaicin.
Capsaicin.
Yeah. Here's an example of something that everyone can have access to freely. You can use it to cook with, you can use it for food, you can use it for whatever you want to use it for. But it also ranges all the way from that to a medicinal compound that you can get as a medicine. And interestingly, it even goes further than that. It can be seen as a weapon, right? Think pepper spray, right? And actually it's in the treaties on international treaties on weapons. So here's something that you can grow in your yard. There's no control over you growing it, but it can be controlled as a drug, as a medicine, a food, and as a weapon where appropriate. And that's, what we want for cannabis. Only cannabis, I don't think, is a biological weapon.
Councilmember Wade Laughter.
Thank you. Some really great fantasies about wishes. This is lovely. So I'll go. I think, again, everyone should have the chance to grow this plant. I think it makes your suggestion, Jen, of Schedule 5, I think it was you who said that it's basically an over-the-counter thing in terms of consumer protections, makes sense. There's an opportunity for business, et cetera, Zao. The whole reason I think it doesn't belong on schedules is if you look at most of the things on those schedules, they all really do have dangers. There's a reason that doses of LSD come in micrograms, which is a really, really, really small amount of something. And when you start talking about fentanyl, that's in Schedule 2. There's a lot of people dying fentanyl. I know I'm not giving news to anybody here, but you drop it all the way down to Schedule 4 and you start talking about, I tried to scribble down, Xanax, Tramadol. There's so many adverse side effects with those medications. I'm sure some of the people in this panel have had those prescriptions for anxiety or PTSD or whatnot. And meantime, you know about the side effects. And if you start trying to quit those medications, suddenly, all of a sudden, suicidal ideation starts happening for the user. And it's just, cannabis does not belong on any of those schedules. It's not comparable to any of those drugs. I'm sorry, it's really not. So, and yeah, if I had my way, yeah, everybody that wants to could grow it. You could cook with it. You could, Well, that's my little fantasy, if you will. And I know we got a long ways to go to get there. I'm really grateful for the changes that have happened in my lifetime. I just got to say, because yeah, when I was a teenager, I knew people who went to jail for having a joint. And unbelievably or not, it still does happen in some parts of this country. Yeah. Anyway, that's all I got. Cheers.
Mary Lynn, did you have a follow-up, or are you going with the next question?
I'll go with the next question, but the quick statement, Wade, when you said that about benzos, I started out a medical surgical nurse, and then my last years in active nursing were for addictions nursing. And it's amazing that benzos are in Schedule 4. They are the hardest. Trying to get somebody off of Xanax who's gotten hooked to it is one of the hardest things to do. And it's a dangerous withdrawal for benzodiazepines. It's amazing that they're in Schedule 4 and people look at them and they think, oh, it's harmless and it's prescribed, no problem. And they're on it forever. But just want to make that comment because, yeah, it's crazy that benzos are in Schedule 4. So question 6.
Pardon
Hemp
me.
cannabis. Oops. Should I go to question 6?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hemp is cannabis that has been legalized federally. In other words, a cannabis plant with 0.3 THC or less in it. Do we want the hemp model at the federal level, or do we want medicine and pharmacists to turn this into treatment?
Well, I mean, again, this is kind of where I will kind of pipe in as a, a medical provider and a medicinal provider for over 2 decades. It has been frustrating to see what happened with hemp and cannabis, to see it kind of go its own way after so many decades of prohibition, and to see it kind of half-assed and chasing cannabinoids is a frustration I don't think Jack Dennis or any of us saw coming down the pike back in the day. It's just it's kind of gone its own way and kind of gone off the rails. So you know, um, I can go to gas stations and see CBD stuff. Before I could go to head shops and see it in a little pill dropper form. And we know that, there's a lot of snake oil salesmen out there. So I don't think that what the government has done regarding cannabis is satisfactory in any way, shape, or form regarding hemp, because there's a lot of additives that aren't listed that are in hemp products that are on the market, a lot of inconsistent hemp products. And again, these are mostly CBD products. It's kind of not proper to call them hemp products, although they are made from the hemp plant. True hemp products, I believe, are the industrial and the oil and the seeds, etc., as opposed to the very short-sighted filtering just the flowers for CBD. That's a short-term outcome to a long-term solution that requires the industrialization of hemp for, industrial scale for seed and for food, as well as for hemp fiber, as well as herd. I was a hemp importer and exporter before I was a medicinal person, so I've been confounded watching the hemp industry flounder from its ignorance on getting its own seed stock from its genetics from way up north, and then trying to grow them in Texas and Oklahoma and places like that, which these seeds are not even close to acclimated. And just for you lay folk, it takes about 2 years of seed crops only to acclimate a genetics to its actual longitude and latitude. And so you've got inconsistency problems. On top of that, people growing it like 6 feet apart like it's pot plants, as opposed to the industrial farming method, which would require about 300 to 400 seed per square meter. So you're talking a full self-competing canopy, as opposed to these bushy wide plants that we are being inundated with as the hemp industry. So no, I don't want the hemp model. I don't want its own classification. It shouldn't be classified, and as stated, it should be, Schedule 5 for those. So the hemp model itself hasn't even been properly wrangled in any way, shape, or form, with more people harmed currently by that. And unfortunately, I feel a bear of responsibility because I was part of that testing. And, various testing groups help find that CBD that, of course, people have run amok with. And so I have my own philosophical, ethical situations regarding that. As a old school hemp producer, I imported hemp jeans. We did the Adidas hemp tennis shoe back in the mid 90s. So these required large industrial infrastructure in Eastern Europe or in China, which we in the United States are not doing. Although I did hear, I think one of the Carolinas is actually investing in a hemp infrastructure for some machinery. But unfortunately, you were seeing a bunch of fly-by-night people with a crash that happened in the CBD market due to the absolute flood, as well as non-regulation of it itself. And I don't see testers making sure that products are pure, whereas we are doing that with medical cannabis currently. I test for heavy metals, I test for herbicides, pesticides. I know everything that is in my product here in California because I was an ethical steward, and I was an integrity litmus for our industry. But not everybody is that way. So with that in mind, I hear the question, Mary Lynn, but I just wanted to launch those caveats of understanding for people who their only understanding is CBD regarding hemp. There is a whole aspect of thousands of products that could be made from hemp, but due to the strong fiber, the herd, etc., that's all being tossed to the wayside in favor of this CBD and its short-term processing, which unfortunately is giving lots of people motivation to get into the industry, but then leaving them high and dry due to these many frustrations from farmers trying to get into it. Now farmers are trying to fight to get out of this industry because there's no infrastructure, or they've been burned, and there's been no proper infrastructure set up at the state county levels. Like, I grew up in Louisiana around sugarcane, so sugarcane mills are central to the sugarcane fields, and so there's actual markets where you can actually take your sugarcane to be bought and sold by its tonnage. Those infrastructures are not set up in most states. So these are missing industrial infrastructures that isn't happening in hemp, that has to be there in the regional production, manufacture, or the interstate commerce. There has to be, one, the finished stable product that is cannabis, which, as we know, still isn't being properly dealt with even here in California, because it's treated like it's a finished stable product. And of course it is an unstable product that is oxygen trapped inside it that's literally eating the crystals away. So we still have issues in the legal market for cannabis itself that we're not addressing, much less has been completely ignored or has turned into kind of the wild, wild west regarding CBD and hemp. So I think I've gotten off my soapbox there, and I will go up to Debbie next.
So unfortunately, I just heard that the 2022 report on the acreage for hemp dropped over 40% from the previous year. So we know that there's some suffering going on in the short term. As far as a federal model, there is no federal model. The only thing we have is what the USDA did with, as far as enforcing the Farm Bill and creating some rules for cultivation and harvest. The FDA, after almost 5 years, has yet to do anything to further the regulations that they need to prepare for, CBD products derived from hemp. The other thing that we've seen that really complicates this is that with the oversupply of CBD after the extraction process, and there was no interest in it when FDA wasn't moving, was, we saw the conversion to the other non-plant derived cannabinoids, such as the Delta 8 is in the plant, but Delta 10 certainly isn't, and acetate ester certainly isn't. And so do we want a model that would foster the sort of semi-synthetics that are really unregulated, are higher in potency and potentially more dangerous as far as psychoses and just overconsumption. So I would say there is no federal model that I would have any interest in following at this point. Thank you.
But if one would have to be created specifically around cannabis with, by, and for cannabis experts, I think if that were there, or if we were called to that, I think that that could be brought to a reality. But unfortunately, that doesn't exist. So I agree with Debbie's point. Wade, you're up next.
Yeah, part of why the hemp thing happened the way it did is CBD, there was enough interest in CBD and a relative lack of CBD that, I don't know, for a period of a year or so, if you could produce a kilo of 70% CBD oil, you could sell it for $10,000. So the combination of those kind of prices and the Farm Bill basically said everybody that was trying to make a living growing corn said, oh, hell yeah, I can grow that. That's a weed. And they did. And yeah, there was a point about a year after that price when it was less than $1,000 for that same kilo of oil. And at an auction in Tennessee, I was following that whole scene there for a few minutes, at an auction in Tennessee where there were a number of very large scale hemp producers. There were a number of buyers who showed up, but none of them bought anything. They all left because the farmers had reserved prices of things like $10 a pound for their biomass, and nobody was willing to buy it. So it would be ideal, to your point, Etienne, about sugarcane and the machinery and facilities necessary to process it. Hemp is a very challenging agricultural product to work, especially by hand. If you go back to the history of hemp cultivation, it was a particularly nasty form of farming. You have to ret cannabis in order to turn it into fiber, for example. And but it was an important enough crop back in the day when this country was founded. It was a military necessity. The Navy needed it for sails and ropes and clothing for sailors. And the Declaration of Independence is written on paper made from hemp. I mean, we can go on and on. This plant's been with us a long time. No real harm done. The harm that's been done around cannabis has got to do with prohibition. The criminality is because of prohibition. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but to me, the hemp, what I do like about the hemp thing that happened is it's normalized cannabis. We're actually talking about it. We're trying to understand. And to me, the ideal model would be education. You know, that more people would understand that this plant is a benign plant. It actually does have healing properties, and the threats to health and human safety are extremely minimal, particularly compared to, you know, someone mentioned it earlier, I think it was Debbie mentioned the benzodiazepines. I ran into those, some of the kids I was trying to help with epilepsy are prescribed high dose benzodiazepines. And it's really tragic to see what it does to those kids. So yeah, I'm done. Thank you.
Councilmember Al Byrne.
Yeah, CBD, you know, I said before and I'll say it again. This is another government tactic of delay. I believe that. I'm not sure they planned it. They don't plan much, but they turn whatever they want into their advantage if they can. Although I don't argue with Wade. In fact, I heartily agree with him that CBD has allowed the conversation nationally to accelerate and be pretty positive. So I think that part is a good deal. So hemp to me is a plant from which you get fiber, seed, food, and oil. To get medicine from hemp, say CBD from hemp, I think is a joke. If it's just not what the plant is made to do. Now, as far as when did all this start, I don't know, but I know that we had a conference in Providence in 2010, and ETN, I'm sorry, but I invited, what's his name? D'Angelo to speak. And he came. And basically what he said was that Harborside had noticed, studied that the patients didn't want this traditional high THC that California was famous for. It was too much for them, that they wanted a reduced THC. And then they noted, he said, at Harborside, that when they increased the CBD level into the plant, the patients were even happier because, again, we know now the CBD modulates the THC. So I don't know whether D'Angelo ETN was the cause of that, but I think the conference helped a lot in letting the industry know that they needed to grow another type of plant that besides a real high THC plant. And I think, oh yeah, I just want to tell you about hemp in Europe. You know, we always talk about the United States, and I'm here talking about the ethnocentric bullshit that we all talk about. Well, here, let me give you a hemp story. So years ago, not that long ago, I interviewed a guy, a very famous hempster in the Netherlands. And in the course of the conversation, he said, well, you know, there's a tax law in Europe about when you buy a brand new car in France or the Netherlands or wherever, you pay a disposal tax when you buy it. So what you're doing is up front, when you're getting rid of your car or your truck, you've already paid for the government to get rid of the thing. So what these car companies and truck drivers did years ago now, I'm talking 10, 12 years ago, they started to incorporate hemp into their automobiles, hemp fenders, hemp dashboards, hemp everything, so that every piece of hemp they put in their car or truck, it became less expensive because it was organic and it didn't have to, quote, be disposed of. Now, here's the little trade secret. If you buy a car made in Europe and you bring it to the United States to sell here, Mercedes-Benz, Saab, whatever the hell it is, it's full of hemp. It's full of hemp. They don't make them different to bring over here. So this hemp has been in part of our world for a long time. It's this, you know, it's the government disinformation that we talked about earlier. But hemp to me, again, is a plant. If we're going to do medicine, it should come from a variety of cannabis bred for that specific purpose. Thank you.
And if you drive a Mercedes, a BMW, a Saab, any European car, Volkswagens too, they contain hemp. Okay, Michael Krawitz, you're up next.
Yeah, man, I was thinking about this. It's a bigger question than it seemed on its face once I started trying to really answer it in my head. But really, basically, before I even say what I'm going to say, I want to say that the USA has not been honest about the treaty requirements, and the DEA that we've run up against so many times in court, using the treaty as a club against us. It's never really been in the spirit of the treaty that they did it. It was in the spirit of the DEA's meanness that they did it, really. The treaty, for example, calls upon federal governments to have a single agency to handle marijuana. We don't. We have NIDA, we have DEA, we have all HHA, all these different things. That's a violation of the treaty right there. For years, the DEA said that you can only grow it under the actual physical control of the federal government of the United States. Absolute bullshit. The State Department called them on it and said that that was bullshit. And still for a while, they still held on to it before they finally gave up on that one. And now they're on the same page with the State Department. Of course, you can grow cannabis outside of the government control under contract for right now under Schedule 1. That's possible. I haven't heard of many yet, but that's opened up, and that's something that will happen. But anyway, as Kinsey and I were looking at the treaty and really looking at this from the perspective of what are we going to do when we legalize cannabis, and then we go back to the treaty body, what does that look like? Try to thought engineer the future a little bit. And the treaty guidance on this stuff is actually pretty straightforward and actually a little bit helpful here, because they don't look at cannabis between hemp or not hemp based on its amount of THC. They do it based on its application. And they have exemptions in the treaty for non-medical, non-scientific use. They give examples of like morphine for photographic photographic developing, and they give the example of hemp seeds and fiber. Hemp seeds and fiber, very classic form of an exemption for hemp. But by having a cohesive strategy where you have the one government agency that is looking at all this and reporting to the treaty body, you then have the ability to look at cannabis across the board based on its application. Are you going to be using it for human intake, or is it for medicine? Is it for food? And how do you apply measures based on that? And if it's for medical and scientific purposes, then the treaty helps you with guidance. If it's not, then you rely on industry. I'm sure in the industry of photographic developing, it tells you how to properly handle morphine, for example. So this is like where we're not at. We need to have, like, our hemp industry should have always been reporting to the treaty body saying how much flower we were growing and stuff. I don't know that we do that at all. And the hemp and cannabis line in the sand of 0.03 or whatever, you could throw that out and just look at cannabis hemp as exempt, except if it's for medicine or for scientific use. And then you have to follow those guidelines. It's just a matter of which guidelines you follow. And I think the industry, the non-scientific, non-medical, what we call our adult regulated access industry, would have very clear guidance on how to do things and adhere to public safety requirements and everything else. If you allow a system based on the law and based on the merits and not based on some crazy notion of prohibition. So I think that's where we need to go, and where we need to get to be, is this one cohesive system that looks at cannabis based on its application. And that's what you were doing before, I think, with poppy. We just a little story. I think it's a fun one. Years ago, we were just joking around and thinking, brainstorming about different things we could do for cannabis activism and activism in general. We're working with these guys in Texas with law enforcement against prohibition. Now they're a law enforcement action partnership. But we had this idea, it's just a brainstorming idea, but take a packet of poppy seeds and you put them in an envelope. And inside the envelope, you have another envelope with red and line and white lines all around it that says, do not open under penalty of law. And that's inside. So if you don't open that, you just grow the poppy seed and you go on with your life, that's fine. But you open up that interior envelope, it tells you how to turn the poppy flower into heroin. And then, of course, after you've read that, then you have to destroy the seeds, the envelopes, everything, because now that you know that, you're committing a crime by possessing them or growing the plant. And you can't get out of it, it now. And we just thought that was really funny, but that's playing with that line in the sand that you were, I think, dancing on before. But anyway, I think if you follow the treaty, like in Austria, for example, you can go to a store and buy cannabis plants as long as they're not bud, as long as they're not flowering. And they just do it under the horticultural exemption of the treaty. Everybody's growing it as a garden accessory, a beautiful plant for their window box. If you flower it and grow the bud, then you need to have a permit to do that under a medical program, for example.
Thank you, Michael. So I think we will now go to our final question, and Debbie will be asking that tonight. Well, it's kind of a two-parter.
So question 7 says, do we want 2 separate approaches that would satisfy the ability to grow? As a patient advocate, would you wish for a highly inspected form of medicinal cannabis medication? And before I open it up to everyone else, I guess I would like to reveal the fact that I was a patient. That's what qualified me to become a commissioner on the Maryland Commission years ago. I benefited from the use, that was language in our legislation. I had leukemia and I needed a bone marrow transplant, and I suffered from wasting after the transplant. And so my dilemma in those days was I was completely immunocompromised as a bone marrow transplant recipient. And it was a Sophie's choice. I had to decide, do I continue to go into wasting and die of starvation, or do I use something that might stimulate my appetite that might have contaminants in it? This was 2006. Maryland was 8 years away from having a law. And so my only source was the illicit market. And to inhale something that might have a fungal spore in it in a completely immunocompromised patient was basically a death sentence. And so it was a horrible decision to have to make. In the end, I found, I guess, a clean illicit source. I don't even know what that means. It sounds like an oxymoron. And I used it and I benefited from it. So I guess what I would like to say to this is, I think there are certain circumstances, whether it's a severely immunocompromised patient or someone that has got a narrow therapeutic index disease, like let's do seizure disorder, where you've got a chronic condition, you've got a narrow therapeutic index drug or disease. You need to know that the drug, the treatment, whatever you want to call it, is consistent batch after batch after batch. And for an immunocompromised patient, you absolutely need to know that there's no microbiological contamination that upon inhalation would cause some sort of fatal pneumonias. So I think under those circumstances, growing your own and being able to meet all those criteria sounds very difficult. But on the other hand, we also know that there are, just like with over-the-counter drugs, there are conditions for which cannabis is used that patients can self-diagnose and can self-treat and can maybe even grow their own medicine. So I guess I want to say I'm in two minds, but I think maybe I'm seeing a world where we could have both peacefully coexist. And with that, I'll turn it over to anybody else.
Well, I will jump in, and everybody else raise your hands accordingly. Yes, because I worked toward, I would definitely want to see the medicinal model for sure, especially for those that are sick. We look at cancer rates are 1 and 2 now, so half of us on here are looking at cancer in our lifetimes potentially. It's just the reality statistically, which means cannabis is always going to be needed. So I do believe that there, and I have been around and I have bought as well as I have grown my own cannabis because I was a patient myself and I had to go through the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I had to even buy Mexican mold cannabis with black seeds in the past. So, that's just the realities of what comes with the territory when you're a patient and you had no choice, which I had, which now we have changed that. There is now access points in 38 states for the most part for you to gain access if you are a medical patient. So I started testing back in 2008 because I got an upper respiratory infection, and as a Gulf War veteran with Gulf War syndrome, I knew that I was also serving AIDS and cancer patients, and I did not want any more deaths on my conscience than what I already had in war. So that was my driving factor then to getting into testing, which of course it turned out to be plate testing needed for finding those molds and mildews. And then, once we started with THC, then finding CBD, and then others, the cannabinoids came forward. And most importantly, so was the ability to test for herbicides, pesticides. And so it's been a process to get there. We couldn't start all in one. It literally started with just testing THC, and the rest kind of escalated from there. So I have had my penance as well as my work internally as a patient and a patient advocate and a patient provider. I know that people can grow some of the best, cleanest cannabis out there if given the correct and growing environments, etc. But I also am aware that there are nefarious people who will not go to that, and I have, as I worked with Ed Rosenthal and amongst other master growers, etc., and traveled to more than my share of gardens, and I've seen more than enough dirty gardens that, dear God, I wouldn't want this pot anywhere near anybody I know, much less, anybody I love, for that matter. So, I am also balanced by that resolve. So I can't forget that. But given proper farming practices, solid genetics, and clean growing environments, there should be access for both. So I do agree, Debbie, there needs to be a kind of a peaceful coexistence that unfortunately doesn't exist in any model, nor does it, I see that reflection in the ASA Schedule 6 model. Maybe we need to create the Model 710 for what we want to see, potentially. Councilmember Laughter, you're up next, sir.
Yes, thank you. I would love to see, yes, to use a term I heard earlier, bifurcated. Thank you, Al. And that bifurcated system would just acknowledge the reality of the fact that, here in California, where you can, according to law, you can grow 4 plants of your own. Right where I happen to live, if I want to obey exact law where it's happening, I would have to grow those 4 plants indoors, which I don't do, of course. But it's an example of how local control has something to do with how all this is going to play out, as long as there is scheduling associated with this plant. And the fact is, yeah, it is a weed. It grows real easily if you have a garden. If you have to do it indoors, it's not a whole lot easier than growing tomatoes indoors, which you can do. But my point is, I think that we need a system that allows folks who can to grow their own. And if they want to make product for themselves, by all means. Again, if it's going to be sold to other folks, there should be some level of testing involved, and ideally education. For the vast majority of people, even in California, they don't have a garden. Most people who live in the Los Angeles area, for example, where, I don't know, 20 million people or something live, a lot of people live there, and most of them don't have a garden. And when you start talking about New York, there's a good portion of upstate New York where people could have gardens, but in Manhattan, garden space is pretty precious. So I think we need both. How to establish that with the feds still involved with how this plant is defined federally. Again, descheduling or Schedule 5 is my summary. And yeah, ideally we have a split system, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Wade. Councilmember Crowitz.
Yeah, right now, cannabis, like in California, it's considered, I think it's considered an agricultural product, but not a full agricultural crop. And then we have, cannabis that's hemp, sometimes maybe is considered an agricultural crop, maybe not, but then basically none of the medical marijuana is being considered a full agricultural crop. And, basically another way to interpret your question is to say, what exactly are the differences between, what everyone would need in terms of product safety from a cannabis product versus what a medical patient would need. And I think that there is a pretty good subset of stuff. I mean, in other words, most of what a medical patient would need is going to be satisfied by what a regular consumer is going to need. Product safety, quality control, lack of contaminants, lack of pesticides, lack of heavy metals, a product that is of known source and matches the label. I mean, that's all basic expectations, again, in our industry, in our regular world of products. But I think what you run into are problems on the margins, really. Like if I was going to be facing something, I'm dealing with just basic medicinal cannabis needs. A lot of medicinal cannabis patients may very well be able to be helped with the community support that Wade's describing. People carefully growing their own, sharing amongst friends and neighbors and stuff. That's a lot of it. But if I'm trying to deal with some kind of cancer, I want, a heavy duty cannabis product, like, you know, what they call Rick Simpson oil, you know, named after Rick Simpson, basically a almost pure cannabis oil in large amounts by the gram, in syringes to take in capsules and stuff. And I'd like to know a little bit more as a consumer, you know, to target that a little bit better. I remember what Dr. What was his name there, the great doctor out there, Abrams, out in San Francisco. He was telling us, you know, hey, we know cannabis helps for cancers, but we don't have enough specific information to say it's a cure. Just talk about, you know, the palliative kind of relief you get. In other words, you get relief from nausea, you get appetite stimulation. All these things are so well known. You just, you know, push on that, and we'll keep working on researching the cancer. And that hopefully is being ongoing really fast, because that's what we really need to know. I need to know this particular kind of cannabis, particular source material, particular, you know, variety, whatever, is going to work on this particular cancer in the particular dose. And you know, until then, I'm going to take, you know, a gram or two a day or whatever they call for of Rick Simpson oil and do the best I can and hope I can get a source of that that's safe. And you know, that's right now is difficult, even in places that have good medical marijuana programs. And it doesn't seem to be getting any easier as we go towards legalization. If they make it hard for these, like I say, outlier products that medicinal patients need, but aren't necessarily what they get in the rec market.
All right, Mary Lynn Mathew, you had a follow-up for Michael?
Yeah, just with what Michael was saying in that, and Deb, you need to have some kind of market that patients can access, or anyone can access, when they need consistency. And to an extent, that's what you were saying, Michael. We want to know what it is. Cannabis is so variable. There's so many factors that come in, but if you find something that works and you've got it controlling your seizures, great. I mean, a great example of that was they were doing some studies with a variety of cannabis for autism. And all of a sudden reports came in that the patients were having terrible reactions. And literally, one put his hand through a window, another was beating up his mother. Some terrible reactions. And it was like, what the heck happened? And it's like, well, we used the same thing. They thought they used the same product with a similar amount of CBD, THC, and maybe a few terpenes. But Betty Mary, who looks at all of the cannabinoids and all of the terpenes in any cannabis variety, it was a study going through him. So he was able to track all of those hundreds of chemicals and to see what the difference was. But the point being, you know, a cannabis plant that's kind of close works for many conditions, helps many people with post-traumatic stress or this or that. But like with autism or maybe certain seizure disorders, there's something that specifically works, whether it's a product that's made, a tincture or something, or it's a particular plant that's used with the genetics. They want that consistency. And so we've got to have a market that somehow will create that. And we need people, again, cannabis is a different thing. You know, in health industry, we understand drugs, and there are too many to know, you know, have a good feeling about. As a nurse, for me, in regular nursing practice, I would want to have somebody, ATN, like you, someone in a dispensary who has the healthcare knowledge. I want them to have a decent background, but somebody as a nurse I can talk to saying, I think I want, you know, this and this, but what have you seen for this particular problem, you know, in terms of where to start, and work together, because cannabis is so complex. You really want an expert who's got a lot of experience with the different varieties and the different, you know, whether we're adding these terpenes or whatever. And then of course, what route of administration would be most best. It's such an individualized medicine. So that's the only thing about separate approaches, that people who want to just grow the plant, to appreciate it, to use it for whatever reason, you know, it doesn't need a model. That should just be, that's our own business. But there should be a model or something there for people who need a product and want to know that it's a safe product.
Well, that will wrap up our conversation. I want to check back in with our guest, Debbie. Do you have any follow ups, or do you have anything that you're promoting or social media? How would people get a hold of you?
No, I'm not. I just want to thank all of you for letting me join this conversation. I really looked forward to it tonight. Thank you, Michael Crowitz, my dear friend. And I'd be happy to join you guys again if you're interested.
Well, absolutely. We appreciate patient advocates as well as experts that are experts in their field, especially regarding cannabis, and we appreciate you coming in tonight. I would like to thank our council members Tony Landry, George Armstrong, Michael Crowitz, Mary Lynn Mathry, Al Byrne, Gage and his little healing buddy. So I won't be too loud there. And I myself am Etienne Fontan, and we're with the Veterans Action Council. Thank you, Debbie Moran. And this has been our conversation about, pardon me, I beg your pardon, no Schedule 2. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with another V.A.C. Roundtable number 45. Thank you very much.
Bye.